Before we begin, Galactic Horrors is now on Patreon. Get daily stories in one place, with no ads and no interruptions. Link is in the description or search Galactic Horrors on Patreon. Now, let's begin the transmission. The tethers sang at 22 Hz that morning, same as every morning for 3 years. I ran my fingertips across the calibration display and watched the mass balance figures resolve. Apex 7 at 99.8% tolerance, containment envelope stable. All 4 anchor points bearing within rated parameters. Below the monitoring bay's lower viewport, the accretion disk of the Singularity spread in its slow rotation of superheated gas mixed with captured rubble. Orange, white, and beautiful, the way industrial kilns are beautiful. All that energy focused to a single function. The function was disposal. The United States government, through a classified subdivision of the Department of Defense called the Exotic Threat Disposal Division, had built Apex 7 11 years ago as the solution to a problem no one wanted to discuss publicly. Anomalous objects, anomalous entities, things that could not be safely stored, studied, or destroyed by any known means. The answer was a drain. Build an artificial singularity, drop the problem through the event horizon, and let physics handle the rest. Matter that crossed a singularity boundary did not come back. That was the theory, and for 11 years it had held. Station Acheron existed to maintain the drain. A 400-meter platform of reinforced titanium and exotic matter cabling, holding position outside the accretion disk on 4 tether systems that I had designed during my doctoral work at Caltech. 14 crew, 6-month rotations for most, longer for senior staff. I was the longest-serving physicist on board. I had designed the tether and field array. Its containment envelope surrounded the engineered horizon. My mass balance protocols kept the system in equilibrium. In a professional sense, I was the reason the drain worked. I was proud of that. Not in the way people talk about at award ceremonies. In the way you are proud of a bridge that holds, a seal that does not leak. It worked because I had built it right. That particular morning, the program designated days of the week to prevent temporal drift in long rotation crews, so it was Tuesday. I was finishing the daily check when Dale Rusk's voice came through the comm speaker above my station. Dale was the senior tether technician, a broad, grey-haired man who had been aboard Acheron since the construction phase. 11 years. He had helped build the station's skeleton, installed the tether housings by hand, and stayed to maintain them while 3 generations of crew rotated through around him. He was running his 72-hour physical inspection of the starboard anchor assembly, outside the hull in the tether housing. Number 3's torque is up 0.5% from last cycle, Dale said. Nothing critical. I'll flag it for the next window. I'll compare it against the last 3 cycles. I marked it in the log. 0.5% was noise. The gravitational environment around Apex 7 produced constant micro-fluctuations in every reading, and learning which mattered and which didn't was half the job. Supply shuttles on approach. 22 minutes to cargo bay intercept. About time. We've been out of decent coffee for a week. The unmanned supply shuttles came every 3 weeks from a logistics depot 9 hours away by emergency burn. Food, equipment, consumables, replacement parts. The shuttle's autopilot would guide the cargo container into Acheron's bay, the doors would seal, and the quartermaster's team would unpack. Routine. I tracked the shuttle's telemetry on my secondary display. The chassis held to the outer navigation corridor, 200 meters clear of the containment envelope. During final transfer, the container separated and crossed the gap to our bay on a narrower tangent. That tangent brought it within 60 centimeters of the envelope at its closest point, still inside the certified margin for an object moving at less than a meter per second. The envelope was not the event horizon itself. It was the outer exchange surface imposed by our tether field, a 600-meter sphere around the microscopic engineered horizon at its center. A disposal that crossed the outer surface entered a directed field gradient and could not stop before reaching the inner aperture. On the mass ledger, Crossing the outer surface counted as inbound before the object reached the point from which light could not return. That distinction had mattered during design reviews. In 11 years of operations, it had never mattered during an accident. Plenty of room. At 14 minutes to intercept, tether number 2 registered an anomalous oscillation. I saw it on the display before I felt it. A transient spike in vibration frequency. 22 Hz jumping to 26, then 29, then dropping back in under 2 seconds. The station's background pitch stuttered. I felt the correction, a brief grinding shift in a frequency I had stopped consciously hearing years ago, but had never stopped interpreting. Any change in the pitch meant something in the gravity well had shifted. The oscillation pushed one arc of the containment envelope outward by 73 centimeters, then drew it back. Less than a meter for less than 2 seconds. The supply shuttle's cargo container had entered its final approach. It separated from the shuttle chassis at the programmed distance and drifted on momentum toward the bay doors. Its path carried it within 60 centimeters of the containment envelope's edge. When the envelope bulged outward, the edge crossed the container's trajectory. The container held 412 kilograms. Food, water purification filters, medical supplies plus replacement actuator components. All of it passed through the containment boundary and dropped into the event horizon of Apex 7. The container's mass signature registered on my gravitometric display, drifted, touched the boundary line, and vanished from real space. The whole event took less than a second. "Dale, we just lost the supply drop." A pause on the comm. "Lost it how?" "Tether 2 oscillated, boundary shifted, the container crossed." A longer pause. "That's going to be a lot of paperwork." I was already pulling up the mass balance ledger to log the loss. We had lost objects to the boundary before, a tethered inspection probe 2 years ago, a handful of tools during an EVA repair. Each time the mass balance had to be recalculated, the containment field retrimmed, the incident documented for Earthside review. The container was larger than anything we had previously lost, but the process was the same. Then the exchange alarm activated. I knew the theory. I had written the models. When mass crossed the exchange surface from real space, the ledger granted the same mass of outward allowance to whatever dimensional space existed beyond the aperture. It was a property of Apex 7's construction, an artifact of the exotic matter framework that made the engineered horizons stable. Natural singularities in deep space did not behave this way. Ours did because the tether field imposed a signed conservation boundary across the interface. Inbound mass created outbound allowance. Outbound mass could occupy only a volume cleared by sending an equal mass of local matter inward. We had observed this before with the small losses. Each time, a lump of dark, inert, dimensional matter had pushed through the horizon and been collected by the containment field's secondary envelope. Dense, cold, physically unremarkable. We catalogued it, stored it in a shielded vault, and noted it in the ledger. A wrench goes in. A kilogram of dead rock comes out. Simple transaction. I expected the same. I pulled up the exchange monitor to track the incoming mass. The readings climbed past 400 kilograms and kept climbing. 500, 600. At 700, a second alarm joined the first. Displacement alert, lower deck, section 14. I pulled the schematics. A storage compartment in the station's lower ring had vanished. The bulkhead sensors showed atmosphere on one side and vacuum on the other. Emergency force screens activated, containing the breach, but the compartment walls, floor, ceiling, shelving, and contents was gone, displaced, replaced by nothing. The exchange was still running. The incoming mass from beyond the aperture continued to grow. As it occupied real space, the field selected an equal mass of acheron inside the exchange surface and sent that mass inward to clear a volume. Every kilogram that arrived therefore removed a kilogram of the station. On the signed ledger, that removal was another inbound kilogram and generated another kilogram of outbound allowance. I ran the cascade projections. The container had given the exchange 412 kilograms of starting allowance. 412 kilograms of entity could emerge. Its arrival sent the same mass of station inward, renewing the allowance instead of spending it. If the boundary could keep selecting station matter, the ledger would never close. The process reinforced itself. Its rate accelerated as the arriving surface gained contact with more of Acheron's structure. Dale, seal your housing and get inside. Runaway exchange. Housing is sealed. I'm coming through the inner lock. Dale asked no questions. He recognized the alarms and trusted the man who understood them. Station Commander Frank Cotter arrived in the monitoring bay 4 minutes later, still pulling on his duty jacket. Cotter was 48, career military, 5 years into his posting as Acheron's commanding officer. He was competent, thorough, and protective of the program's classification status, in the way that men who have signed enough secrecy agreements begin to treat secrecy as a form of professional ethics. What hit us? I explained. He listened. Then he asked his first question. Did the exchange event transmit in the automated telemetry burst? The burst went 6 minutes ago. It would have caught the oscillation and the container loss. Probably not the exchange cascade that triggered after the burst window closed. Good. Next scheduled burst is 90 minutes. He studied my display, watched the mass readings climb. Can you stop this before then? I could tell him the station was being consumed from the bottom up, and his concern was whether Earthside Command would find out before he could frame a narrative. I chose not to resent it. Cotter was doing the job the program had trained him to do. I need to physically recalibrate the 3 field-shaping junctions, I said. They feed a master manifold in the lower core, where all 4 tether trunks enter the station. Tighten the field to maximum tolerance, and the exchange should choke to a halt. How long? Junctions are in 3 different sections. 45 minutes if nothing slows me down, an hour on the outside. And if you don't finish? I pointed at the displacement map. 8 compartments gone, all in the lower sections where the hull material was thinnest. 4 screens holding, but every screen drew power, and every displaced section removed structural mass the station needed. At the current rate, enough structure fails in about 60 minutes to trigger cascading hull breakup. After that, the station comes apart. Cotter processed this. Do it. Take Rusk. Keep it off the general comm. I'll frame the displacements as hull damage from the shuttle approach. The crew doesn't need to know the containment boundary shifted. They can see the missing sections, Frank. The crew will follow orders and report to safe zones. Go. Dale met me in the junction corridor on Deck 3. He had his tether toolkit across his back and his boots magnetized against the gravity fluctuations that were worsening as the Singularity's mass profile shifted beneath us. The station's main lighting had cut to conservation mode when the 4 screens activated, diverting power from non-essential systems. Red emergency strips along the floor and ceiling gave the corridors the look of a vessel already halfway to wreckage. Crew members passed us in pressure suits, moving toward the core modules under Cotter's evacuation routing. Their helmets remained open while the corridor held pressure. They moved quickly without speaking. A few saw the physicist beside the tether technician heading away from the safe zones. None broke from the evacuation line. We passed through a section where the damage was exposed. The port side wall of Corridor 7 was gone. Where it had been, an emergency force screen projected a luminous blue-white barrier between the corridor's atmosphere and open space. Through the barrier, the accretion disk filled the view, a vast curtain of superheated matter, close enough that individual eddies and density bands were visible in its surface. I had studied that disk from the monitoring bay viewport 1,000 times. Seeing it through a wound in the station's skin, with nothing between me and it except a force screen on backup power, was a different kind of education. Keep moving, Dale said. He was already past me, already working the problem. 12 steps into the junction corridor, I saw what waited at its end. Boyd's duty station had been in junction access compartment 3A. Mike Boyd, 26, electrical systems technician, 4 months into his first rotation aboard Acheron. His job that morning had been power distribution checks on the force-screen network, making sure the emergency barriers had the amperage to hold. The compartment was gone. Console, chair, bulkhead panels, deck plating, all displaced. A force screen covered the vacuum gap, its blue-white light throwing hard-edged shadows into the corridor. Dale stopped. He stood at the barrier and looked through it at the space where Boyd had sat. I checked my diagnostic unit. The displacement log confirmed it. Junction access 3A, displaced at timestamp 1411. Total mass displaced, approximately 900 kilograms. The compartment's weight plus equipment, plus Boyd. Boyd weighed about 80 kilograms. The exchange had credited that mass the same as any other. 80 kilograms of a 26-year-old kid from Dayton had bought 80 more kilograms of whatever was pushing through from the other side. Dale looked at the reading on my screen. He worked through the numbers without me saying them aloud. Dale understood mass through a builder's working life rather than a physicist's equations. Mass in, mass out. Boyd was part of the equation now. His unfinished power check still showed green on the corridor repeater, a routine task reporting success from a compartment that no longer existed. "Come on," I said. "Junction's through the next section." Dale followed. He did not look back at the barrier. The primary tether junction was intact, a room-sized space packed with exotic matter conduits and calibration interfaces. The tether system was not software. It could not be recalibrated from a control panel somewhere safe. The exotic matter cables responded to physical adjustments in their housings, actuator positions, tension bolts, alignment pins. Combined with field-shaping code run from the junction's dedicated terminal, changing the containment envelope meant hands-on hardware. I worked the terminal. Dale worked the actuators, adjusting tension on the tether housing's anchor bolts with a hydraulic wrench that weighed more than my diagnostic kit. The junction vibrated around us. Tether cables carried the aperture's gravitational stress through the housing. Standing inside it was like occupying a bridge during an earthquake that never ended. The frequency slid between pitches as the mass distribution changed. Each shift traveled through the deck plates into my boots and knees. I ran the calibration sequence, tightened the containment envelope by 8% across the primary junction's arc, watched the displacement rate on my portable unit drop. The interval between events, which had fallen below 3 minutes on our way down, widened to 5. The structural failure estimate moved from 52 minutes to 68. We had not stopped the cascade. We had forced it to spend longer, finding each new volume of station matter. While the calibration locked in, I pulled the real-time displacement map and overlaid it on the station schematic. The consumed sections were concentrated in the lower and mid-level decks, thinner hull material, lower mass density, easier for the exchange to bite through. Predictable. But when I traced the displacement locations in sequence, a pattern emerged. The missing sections formed a rough corridor from the Singularity-facing hull up through the station's lower structure toward the core. I dismissed it. Corridors were low-mass voids between high-mass ribs. The exchange ate the lowest density material first. A path-shaped pattern was a predictable artifact of how the station was built, water following the lowest ground. There was no intent behind it. There was only physics. "First junction's locked," Dale said, pulling his wrench free from the final actuator. "How's it look?" "Exchange rate down about 30%, 2 to go." He rolled the wrench into his toolkit, his movements careful. In the red emergency light, his face carried 11 years of work beside a Singularity, and right now every year showed. He had probably known Boyd's parents' names. "Let's go," he said. The route to the second junction took us through the mid-ring, near the research laboratories where exiled anomalies had been processed before disposal. The damage was worse here. A section of deck plating in the transit corridor had been displaced. A gap, roughly 4 meters across, bridged by an emergency grate the damage control system had deployed automatically. Through the grate's mesh, I could see the deck below, and through a secondary gap in that deck, vacuum. 2 layers of station, consumed. We crossed one at a time. The grate held. Around us, the station's superstructure protested in a language of stress and redistribution. Structural members absorbing loads they were never designed to carry, joints flexing past their engineered range. Acheron was compensating for its own digestion. The research labs were dark and powered down, their equipment mothballed between disposal operations. I had been through these rooms dozens of times, usually to verify mass readings on an anomaly before it was guided into the disposal chute that fed the Singularity. Containment pods lined the walls, shielded chambers the size of cargo crates where exiled objects and entities had been held, scanned, classified, and prepared for transit. Each pod bore a serial number and a classification tag. I had access to the records for every anomaly processed during my 3 years aboard. The full 11-year archive sat behind a clearance wall I had never been given reason to climb. The second tether junction occupied an equipment bay adjacent to the lab section. I connected to the diagnostic system and initiated calibration. The sequence would take 12 minutes. The exotic matter conduits required a specific warm-up ramp that could not be shortened without risking tether integrity. While it cycled, I did something I should have done in the monitoring bay. I ran a gravimetric composition reconstruction of the incoming entity. I needed its composition. The containment field's response profile could be tuned for specific material densities, and knowing what this thing was made of would let me optimize the final junction's calibration. Practical reasoning, physics. I combined density, thermal response, field susceptibility, and absorption readings from the exchange sensors. The reconstruction compared those measurements with response profiles archived during each disposal. The results came back layered. The entity was not uniform. Its mass signature showed distinct strata of different compositions and densities, compressed into a structure with measurable internal variation. Dense cores wrapped in denser shells, banded like geological formations, but on a scale of thousands of kilograms. I had expected homogeneity, dimensional matter, whatever that meant, crushed into a single undifferentiated bulk by the extreme conditions beyond the horizon. This had architecture, internal differentiation, depth. Some of the compositions were flagged by my system. Mass profile matches to records in the disposal database. I opened the cross-reference and felt the floor shift under me. 12 matches. 12 of the 47 anomalies exiled during my tenure showed compositions that appeared in trace or significant quantity within the entity's mass signature. Object 17, the Harrow device, a crystalline structure that had generated localized gravity inversions on a colony world before it was seized and exiled, matched a stratum near the entity's dense core. Object 31, a biological specimen of unknown origin that had been flash-frozen and shipped to us after it began growing through the walls of its storage facility on Earth, matched a broad band of organic mineral composite in the entity's middle layers. The mass signatures were degraded, transformed by pressure and time, but recognizable the way a fingerprint is recognizable, even when the finger has been crushed. The thing pushing through the Singularity contained material from what we had thrown in. I forced myself to think like a physicist. Matter beyond the horizon existed in an extreme pressure environment. Exiled mass would be pulverized, compressed, mixed with local dimensional substrate. Trace compositions appearing in exchange material was unremarkable. Recycled ingredients. It did not mean the exiled anomalies had survived or maintained any coherent identity. The raw materials matched because the raw materials were the same, the way ash contains traces of the wood that burned. The calibration continued its cycle beside me. Dale was shoulder deep in a different problem. One of the junction's actuators had warped under gravitational stress, its housing bent several degrees off true. He had braced it with a hull jack, a heavy powered strut designed for emergency structural support, and was holding the alignment by force, while the calibration software compensated. The bay was too small for the work. We moved around each other with the coordination of men who had solved adjacent problems in tight spaces before, each trusting the other to stay out of the way at the right moments. Dale, how many anomalies did the program exile before I came aboard? He adjusted the jack's angle without looking up. I don't have a count. A lot. The first couple of years before your containment system went operational, the disposals were crude. Shoved them through with the construction barges. No measurement to speak of. Some were heavy. He gave the jack another quarter turn. There was a month in year 2 when 3 shipments came in the same week. 2 of them needed reinforcement on the disposal chute, or they'd have torn the track right off the hull. How heavy? Thousands of kilos. One, a piece of mining equipment from a colony dig site that had started moving on its own and killed 4 workers, was close to 2,000 by itself. I ran the numbers on my diagnostic unit while the calibrations cycled. If the program's 11-year total was in the range of 10 to 20,000 kilograms, the conservation exchange had a proportional mass pool sitting on the other side of the horizon. But the entity's current reading had passed 38,000 kilograms and was still climbing. Even a generous estimate of cumulative exiled material could not account for it. I contacted Cotter on the command channel. Frank, I need the full disposal records. 11 years. Total exiled mass. That archive is classified above your clearance, Neil. My calibration is based on the entity's mass profile. If I'm working from incomplete data, the containment settings will be wrong and we lose the station. I need the number. Silence on the channel. Then another displacement alarm in the background of Cotter's transmission. Another section of the station consumed while we argued about access permissions. Approximately 16,000 kilograms, Cotter said. Total. Over 11 years. I looked at my display. The entity's arrived mass had just crossed 41,000. More than twice the total exiled material. The anomalies the program had dropped through the horizon over 11 years had not simply accumulated on the other side, waiting inert in the dark. They had been absorbed into something that grew. Dimensional matter, local substrate, whatever existed in that extreme pressure space beyond the boundary. It had incorporated the exiled material and built on it, the way a reef builds on its own dead. The disposal program had not been feeding a void. It had been feeding a foundation. The calibration completed 56 minutes after the container loss. I locked the second junction's settings and watched the displacement rate drop further. The projected breakup time moved beyond 90 minutes, bought by the work at both junctions. The cascade was grinding toward a stall, but the entity's total arrived mass continued to grow, and the mass was already larger than anything the containment system had been rated to manage. I was squeezing the aperture smaller, making the exchange work harder for every kilogram. It was working, but the thing on the other side had 41,000 kilograms of presence in real space, a new displacement alarm. I pulled the location and felt it land. Section 9, upper deck. The backup communications relay. The entire relay housing had been displaced, secondary antenna array, power supply, signal processor. Gone. The primary comm system was in Cotter's command section, and he had physically isolated its transmitter to keep the exchange event out of the telemetry. The backup had been our emergency fallback, the only system capable of restoring the carrier without a full maintenance reset. Now it was gone. If Cotter changed his mind about calling for help, he had nothing to call with. Last junction's in the lower core, I told Dale as I packed my diagnostic kit. Closest section to the Singularity. Strongest gravitational load on the station. Dale pulled the hull jack free from the actuator housing and strapped it to his toolkit. His movements had slowed over the past hour. Sustained physical work in shifting gravity exacts a compounding toll, and Dale was not a young man. I know where it is, Neil. I installed it. Then you know what it's like down there under normal conditions. Right now it's worse. He shouldered his kit and met my eyes. Whatever he was carrying about Boyd, about the 11 years of work that had led to this morning, about the 16,000 kilograms of exiled nightmares that had apparently been building something in the dark. He packed it behind the same expression he wore when a tether bolt stripped at 3 a.m, and the job was to fix it before the next shift. "Let's get it done," he said. We headed for the lower core. The lower core punished us by degrees. Each level down increased the gravitational pull from apex 7 by a measurable fraction. My weight climbed roughly 8% per deck, a distortion the station's gravity compensators could only partially offset. Alignment marks on surfaces that should have been level had separated by millimeters, the accumulated deflection bowing them toward the Singularity-facing wall. Local gravity no longer pointed squarely through the decks. Work tables in the transit rooms had shed their contents. Tools, data pads, and a coffee mug migrated across the surfaces and collected against the downslope edge, as though the station were listing. The compensators displayed a cumulative 8% increase at the first lower core landing. By the final junction, the model predicted nearly 20%, with the pull canted toward the aperture. Dale walked with his toolkit slung low across his back, compensating for the shifting center of gravity the way a man adjusts to a heavy pack on rough terrain. He had worked down here for 11 years. His body knew the gradient even when his body was tired. In the corridor outside the auxiliary pump station, 2 levels above the final junction, we found the entity for the first time. In the spaces where displacement had consumed station material, something occupied the gaps. Dense, dark material, compressed into visible layers, strata of different compositions fused under enormous pressure, like a cliff face exposing geological history. Where the entity's arrived mass met remaining station surfaces, it pressed against them with physical weight, seated inside Acheron's skeleton without bonding to it. A foreign body in a host structure. I set 2 instrument probes against the boundary where station bulkhead met entity material. The titanium alloy accepted the first point with the minute compliance recorded in its specifications. The entity's fractured mineral surface did not register a mark. Its reaction gauge climbed beyond the calibrated range. Density came from the field reading rather than touch, nearly 9 times that of the adjoining alloy. The surface occupied the missing compartment to within 2 millimeters of its former wall plane. This was placement, not material spreading at random. My portable unit registered density readings that exceeded anything in my Singularity models. This matter had been compressed in a high-gravity environment for years, perhaps the full 11 since the disposal program began. The dimensional space beyond the horizon was not a void. It was a press. I mapped the displacement locations against the entity's arrived mass on my diagnostic screen. The consumed sections were concentrated in the lower decks, consistent with the mass density gradient I had dismissed at the first junction. But down here, at higher resolution, the pattern sharpened. The missing sections formed a framework, voids arranged with regularity, with the entity's arrived mass filling them like components seated into a chassis. The displacements were clearing space, and the entity was occupying that space with purpose. Dale saw it too. He ran his palm along a section where entity material filled a void between 2 intact ribs, bracing against them with the fit of a shim cut to specification. "That's load-bearing," he said. He was not guessing. 11 years of work gave him the vocabulary. "It's using the station's frame as scaffolding." We reached the lower tether housing, the physical structure where the exotic matter cables anchored to the station's hull through massive bolt assemblies. Dale opened the access panel for a visual check while I staged my equipment for the final junction, and he stopped moving. "Neil, come look at this." The anchor bolts, hexagonal fasteners, each the diameter of my forearm, machined to tolerances I had specified in my original design, had shifted in their seats. Dale showed me with a measuring caliper. Fractions of a degree, consistent across every bolt in the housing, all turned in the same rotational direction, as though someone had worked down the row with a wrench and given each one a calculated adjustment, every bolt intact, every bolt within stress tolerance, but repositioned. I checked the containment field profile that resulted from the shifted anchors. If the shifts continued on their current trajectory, the containment envelope would invert within 40 minutes. Instead of projecting outward to contain the singularity, the field would project inward, pulling station mass toward the horizon while accelerating the entity's ejection into real space. The containment system I had designed to keep the singularity contained would become the entity's delivery mechanism. I stood in the lower tether housing and looked at bolts I had specified, in housings Dale had installed, adjusted by something that understood the system well enough to turn it inside out. Mass density physics does not reposition anchor bolts. There was no rationalization left. Cotter's voice came over the comm, stripped of its usual control. Another displacement had taken part of the crew quarters on Deck 5. 2 more people gone. The remaining crew, 9 now, were packed into the core modules. Cotter wanted me to abandon the recalibration and activate the station's emergency scuttle protocol. "It's a command-level override," he said. "It destroys the station and everything aboard, including whatever's coming through." I told him no. If the scuttle dropped Acheron into the singularity, the entire station's mass, every kilogram of titanium, exotic matter, equipment, and crew, became exchange credit. The entity would receive hundreds of thousands of kilograms of passage rights to push through from the other side. We would die. The entity would arrive in full, and the only thing we would have accomplished was giving it the largest meal the program had ever served. "Then what do you want me to do?" Cotter asked. "Keep the crew alive and let me finish the junction." The third tether junction sat in the lowest accessible section of Acheron, a maintenance bay walled on 2 sides by the entity's arrived mass. The dark, compressed material filled adjacent compartments, pressing against the bulkheads with slow, physical insistence. The tidal forces made every step a negotiation. My weight was up nearly 20% from baseline, and each motion toward the singularity-facing side of the bay cost effort I registered in my calves and lower spine. Dale was fading. Hours of sustained labor in shifting gravity had compounded through his body. The calibration was the most complex of the 3. The entity's tether manipulation had already altered the junction's configuration, and I was working against modifications that continued in real time. I corrected one anchor's field angle. A bolt on the adjacent assembly shifted. I reversed the shift and retrimmed the field. Another bolt moved. The entity and I were recalibrating the same system in opposite directions. I was tightening the containment envelope. It was loosening it. Neither of us was gaining ground. Dale held physical equipment in position while I worked, hull jacks bracing actuators, his body weight counterbalancing the tidal pull on tools that drifted toward the singularity-facing wall. We worked without speaking. The cooperation was necessary, built from years of solving problems in spaces too small for the tools the problems required. During a calibration pause, I accessed the junction's deep diagnostic archive to pull alignment drift data, maintenance logs, anything that might help me predict the entity's next adjustment. The archive was partitioned. Most of it was accessible with my clearance. One section was locked behind a command-level access code. The displacement events had degraded the security infrastructure. The access verification system was running on backup logic, fragmented. I was inside the classified partition in 40 seconds. The station's full emergency protocols were stored there: reactor emergency, hull breach cascade, collision avoidance, and one more, filed separately, with its own cover page and engineering appendix, a protocol designated offset exchange. I opened it. The protocol's function described in engineering language, stripped of every word that might carry ethical weight. In the event of a runaway conservation exchange, authorized the sequential release of station personnel through the containment envelope into the event horizon of Apex 7. The engineering appendix explained why. Living mass coupled more strongly to a separately phased return field, a property observed during early testing but never published or included in the containment models I had built my career on. Ordinary matter sent inward renewed outbound allowance and worsened a cascade. Under the return phase, living matter became an anchor. 1 kilogram crossing inward could bind 12 kilograms of emerging mass and pull it back before the field reset. The distinction existed in hardware and in a signed coefficient hidden from every model I had received. The protocol calculated that the station's crew complement of 14, at an average of 75 kilograms per person, would generate approximately 12,600 kilograms of reverse exchange credit, enough to push a significant incoming mass back through the horizon and halt a cascade. I read the appendix twice. The entity's weight pressed around the bay while the containment system fought itself. I sat with the protocol on my screen. Its personnel table converted every bunk assignment into available biological return mass. The program's architects had built an accounting system that ended with us. They had designed this facility with a human sacrifice contingency. They had staffed it with 14 people, rotation after rotation, year after year, knowing the contingency existed. They had classified it above the clearance of every person on board except the commander, ensuring that the crew whose bodies the math required would never know they had been assigned a credit value in an exchange rate table. My containment models, the models I had spent 3 years refining, the work I considered my professional contribution to national safety, were missing a fundamental variable because the people who hired me had chosen to keep it from me. I opened the comm channel. "Frank, offset exchange." Silence. Then, "Where did you find that?" "The junction's classified partition. Security's degraded. The question isn't where I found it. The question is how long you've known." I could hear the station's superstructure protesting around both of us. The same redistributed loads, the same complaints transmitted through a comm channel that was not built to carry what I was asking. "Since my command briefing," Cotter said. 5 years. "You told me the scuttle code would destroy the station. This protocol doesn't destroy anything. It feeds crew members into the Singularity and uses their bodies to buy exchange credit. I wasn't going to use it unless the station was already lost, Neil." "Then why were you pushing me to activate it?" "Because Command presented the scuttle control as a clean return of the occupied core. I knew the crew were the return mass. I did not know about the coefficient, or that the field would release the rest of the station afterward. They never gave me the engineering appendix." His pause before answering had been a fraction too long. The 12-minute relay delay to Earthside Command meant there was no one to check his claim against. I could not tell if the man was lying. I was not sure it mattered. Even if Cotter had genuinely believed the scuttle code would kill the station cleanly, he had accepted command of a facility with offset exchange in its operating manual. He had read the protocol during his briefing 5 years ago, understood that the station's crew had been classified as mass balance resources, and stayed. He had run drills, signed leave forms, written performance reviews for people whose bodies the program's architects had already denominated in exchange credits. Dale had heard every word over the open channel. He stopped working. He stood in the junction bay with the hull jack in one hand and looked at me across the cramped space. Neither of us spoke. Dale had been on Acheron for 11 years. He had eaten meals in the galley, played cards in the recreation module, filed maintenance reports at the end of every shift, and slept in a bunk aboard a station that was designed, from its foundation bolts to its classified protocols, to feed him to a singularity if the arithmetic demanded it. He had installed the tether housings with his own hands. The containment boundary he could be pushed through was his work as much as mine. Something in his expression changed, the look of a man revising 11 years of memory in light of a single document. Then the displacement alarm shrieked through the junction bay. The compartment adjacent to our position, a utility space packed with power distribution hardware, vanished. The force screen that should have contained the breach activated and immediately overloaded, its projector damaged by the displacement's edge effects. The barrier collapsed. The air moved. Explosive decompression tore through the bay as atmosphere rushed toward the gap. A titanium support brace, already sheared through one mount by the missing compartment, pivoted into the outflow. The pressure differential and slanted gravity vector drove its loose end across the space. It caught Dale in the left side. The impact threw him against the secondary bulkhead. He went down. I grabbed the emergency seal handle and cranked the backup partition closed. The rush stopped. Emergency reserves repressurized the bay. Dale was on the deck, curled over his left side, breathing in short, controlled pulls. His face was drawn with the effort. Broken ribs at minimum. The way he held his left arm against his torso suggested worse. I got him upright against the bulkhead. His eyes were clear, tracking, angry. "Can you walk?" He nodded, tried standing. Made it with one hand braced on the wall. "Mid-ring," I told him. "The evacuation pods are docked in Section 7. Get to one. Get whoever can reach you into the others. There's still actuator work." His voice was strained, each word costing him air he was rationing. "You need hands on the bolts." "The junction is close to done. I can manage the physical adjustments with the hull jack. I need you at a pod, Dale, because when this is over, Cotter is going to file a report that says the tethers failed on their own, and Offset Exchange is going to disappear into a classified archive, and nobody will ever know what this station was built to do, unless someone who stood in this bay tells them." Dale looked at me. 3 years of shared work, 11 years of his life on this station. He was running the same calculations I was, my odds of finishing alone, his odds of reaching the mid-ring with broken ribs in shifting gravity, the odds that any of it mattered. He took his toolkit off his back and set it on the deck beside me. Before he left, he removed the junction's command wafer and pressed it into the recorder socket on his suit. The degraded security system copied the offset file, its engineering appendix, and the last hour of exchange telemetry. A green completion bar crossed his wrist display. He closed the cover over it with his thumb. Then he used the hull jack to drive the master manifold release pin halfway out of its locked collar. I could finish that work alone now. He walked toward the corridor that led up to the mid-ring. He did not say goodbye. I did not say it either. We were not ready to make it one, and saying it would have made it true. I was alone in the lower core. The third junction's calibration locked at 87% of maximum tolerance, the best I could achieve against the entity's interference. I had countered most of its tether adjustments and squeezed the containment envelope to the tightest configuration the system could sustain. The displacement rate dropped to near zero. For several minutes, watching the numbers flatten on my portable unit, I believed the cascade had stalled. The entity adapted. Instead of pushing through the containment envelope, it began displacing the junction components themselves. The exotic matter conduits that projected the containment field started vanishing. A connector housing first, then a coupling sleeve, each piece consumed and replaced by vacuum. Then a 2-meter length of primary conduit disappeared from the junction's central array, and with it went 8% of the field's projection capacity. The entity was eating the lock. I recalibrated around each loss, compensating for reduced conduit by narrowing the field's focus, squeezing what remained into a tighter beam. Every correction reduced the envelope's maximum output. The entity consumed another section. I compensated. Another. Compensated again. Each adjustment was smaller than the last, and each piece of consumed conduit fed the entity more mass credit to consume the next. I ran the projections. At the current rate of component loss, the containment system would be fully consumed within 20 minutes. The entity would finish arriving. The station would be gutted. Everyone still aboard, me in the lower core, whatever crew had not reached the evacuation pods, would be displaced into the exchange. I opened the comm to Cotter. "Frank, launch the evacuation pods. Now, every pod, every crew member who can reach one." For once, Cotter did not argue about secrecy or containment or how the telemetry would read. Maybe the past hour had burned the institutional reflexes out of him, or maybe he was already standing at a pod hatch. "Launching," he said. Through the station's frame, distantly, I felt the concussion of pod separation charges firing. 1, 2, a third, crew getting out. Or trying to. 2 options remained. I could abandon the junction and try to reach an evacuation pod. The mid-ring was 4 sections and 2 deck transitions away, through a station that was being consumed around me, with gravity increasing at every step toward the Singularity-facing side. Or I could sever the tethers. Severing was not recalibration, it was termination. If all 4 tether trunks were released from the lower core master manifold, the containment envelope would collapse entirely, and Apex 7, which required the tether's exotic matter field to maintain its stability, would rapidly decay. Singularity evaporation released a burst of radiation and gravitational energy that would destroy the station at this proximity. But the dimensional boundary that the Singularity maintained would close. The exchange would stop. Whatever portion of the entity had already arrived in real space would be stranded, cut off, with no pathway to bring the rest of itself through. The evacuation pods, if Cotter had launched them in time, should be far enough from the evaporation burst to survive. Their radiation shielding was rated for proximity operations. The numbers were not clean. They were the best numbers left. I had designed the manual severance into the system myself. Physical cable disconnects at every junction, because exotic matter tethers could not be remotely deactivated. A safety feature. A last resort. I had never imagined using it to kill the Singularity rather than preserve it. I pulled Dale's toolkit toward me and found his heavy wrench, the one he had carried for 11 years, the handle worn smooth where his grip had polished it through a decade of tether maintenance. The 4 trunk housings were secured by 4 locking bolts each, 16 fasteners across the manifold. They were the same hexagonal type the entity had been repositioning. Dale had already freed the common release pin. I set his wrench on the first bolt of the port trunk and turned. The gravitational load fought every motion. My arms were heavy, my grip strained by the tidal gradient that wanted to drag everything in the bay toward the Singularity-facing wall. The bolt resisted, then broke free, and the tether cable shifted in its housing. The vibration changed pitch. The frequency climbed a half step, and I felt the station register the loss the way a bridge registers the removal of a cable. Second bolt. Third. Fourth. The port trunk moved in its collar and its field quadrant fell away. I crossed to the dorsal housing, released its 4 fasteners, then dragged the wrench towards starboard against the slanted pull. Each trunk represented years of calculations I had treated as a complete description of the system. Now I could see the omitted terms in the empty compartments around me. I freed the starboard trunk. 12 bolts lay loose against their retainers. Only the ventral housing still carried load. As the field weakened, the distortion it had been projecting across the junction's lower viewport began to clear. The reinforced glass offered a view into the space the entity had been building inside the station, and with the field's interference fading, the image resolved into something I could finally see whole. It was enormous, a structure of compressed, layered material filling the lower sections of Acheron's skeleton, dark against the accretion disk's glow. Internal striations marked transitions between different densities and compositions, each band an era of compression, each boundary a record. The Harrow device's crystalline density sat near the core. The biological specimen's organic mineral composite formed a broad middle layer. Around them, other exiled anomalies had been crushed together by years of pressure. Their signatures remained the way sediment retains fossils. Everything humanity had tried to throw away had fused into a structure with depth, history, and internal order, and it was moving. A slow, massive reorientation, the shifting of something enormous finding its balance after a long confinement. The conservation law had given it the framework, the mass credit accounting that justified its passage into real space. The entity was adjusting under its own power. It had used the conservation law as a door, The intent to walk through it was its own. I checked the pod vectors before touching the last housing. 3 signals were moving outward behind Acheron's shielded upper ring. Their courses diverged as programmed, preventing one fragment field from taking every survivor. The nearest had passed the minimum burst radius and continued to accelerate. A status packet listed 7 occupied couches across the pods. Dale's suit recorder was aboard the lead craft. I released the final 4 bolts. The ventral trunk slid free of its housing. Its tension passed through my gloves and the deck, then ceased. The exotic matter field collapsed. Apex 7, unmoored from the field that had maintained its structure for 11 years, began to decay. The gravitational gradient spiked, then dropped, then spiked again as the Singularity destabilized. The station lurched beneath me. I grabbed the junction frame and held on while forces the hull was never built to absorb rippled through every member. Through the viewport, the entities arrived mass, cut off from the exchange, stranded mid-arrival, drifted free of the station's frame. It was incomplete, enormous, structured, purposeful, but unfinished. Less than half of whatever it had been building toward. It hung against the stars, slowly turning, trailing filaments of compressed matter that reached toward a dimensional boundary that no longer existed. The aperture began to close from its outer surface inward. One last paired displacement crossed the lower core before the ledger vanished. The junction frame, Dale's wrench, and my body went inward together. For an interval too brief for the display to count, I saw Acheron from the far side of the boundary. The engineered horizon decayed behind me. The viewport polarized against a white radiation bloom while the station came apart. Beyond its breaking frame, the stranded entity turned in the dying light of the drain I had built and began to unfurl. Frank Cotter's evacuation pod was recovered by the logistics depot's emergency response team 11 hours later, after a cautious braking approach and a 2-hour search among the pod beacons. Dale Rusk was among the survivors. 7 of 14 crew. The station, the Singularity, and Neil Adams were gone. Cotter filed an incident report attributing Acheron's loss to a catastrophic tether failure triggered by a supply shuttle collision. The exile program was suspended pending review. The protocol designated offset exchange was not mentioned in his filing. Dale submitted his suit recorder through the recovery team's medical officer before Command Security could isolate the survivors. Its telemetry and copied appendix were sealed into the same classified review that accepted Cotter's account. The evidence survived, though no public record showed that it existed. The entity's remains drifted in a decaying orbit around the coordinates where Apex 7 had been. Observation satellites redirected under classified authority confirmed that the mass was stable, structured, and radiating low-level thermal energy consistent with internal activity. It was not inert. It was not growing. The observation reports used the word quiescent, which satisfied the committee that reviewed them without answering anything. The reports were classified. The observation continued. No one visited. No one could say what would happen if the entity finished becoming what it had started to become, because no one who remained understood the physics well enough to model it. The program's architects were retired or dead. The one man who had understood the containment system, who had designed the drain and given his life to close it, was part of the exchange now, his mass somewhere beyond a dimensional boundary that no longer had a door, paying a debt that had never been his.